Tonight, what has gone wrong with Anthony Albanese? Or was he never up to the job? A former top Labor staffer tells about the man he knows and worked with. The man that voters didn't know until now. Don't miss it. Plus, Melbourne's school strike for Palestine. But who were all the adults there? And why did it turn into such a hate fest against Israel? Plus, is the government's border policy falling apart? A boat from Indonesia lands a dozen people on our coast. And tonight, also a huge victory in Holland that will shake Europe. Victory for a politician who's promised to stop all Islamic immigration. Meanwhile here, our government defends its decision to bring in 860 Palestinians with even sillier excuses.
Just as not everybody from Afghanistan is linked with the Taliban, not everybody who is Palestinian is a member of a terrorist organisation.
I'll fact check that nonsense for you later. And a warning, if you're having dinner, you might want to look away, because coming up is Barnaby Joyce and the massive rat plague in Queensland that has the coast littered with these dead rodents. But first, shocking news today. This country is now at a critical tipping point because the Albanese government is worse than Whitlam and is now desperate with your money. It's finally seeing what I've warned since the day it was elected. Its green energy revolution, renewables everywhere, is a total failure and now faces total collapse. Much higher prices for our electricity, but more blackouts. The problem today, the madness, is that instead of admitting this and pulling back, Energy and Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen has announced he's going to go double or nothing. In fact, 500% harder with your money. He'll spend a lot more of it. But just how much? He won't tell you because you'd probably be horrified. Now, I can't tell you how catastrophic this could be for jobs, for businesses and for your power bills, because it was 3 weeks ago, of course, that Treasurer Jim Chalmers, he did first sound the alarm, warning that the government's plan to switch us to wind and solar power was actually heading over a cliff. All of its targets, you see, are shot.
We will need to do even more to secure sufficient renewable energy generation, transmission and storage to meet our ambitions.
And 2 days ago, Chris Bowen agreed, but very grudgingly, and a euphemism, because this is all on him.
I'm pleased with the progress we've made so far, but far from satisfied.
Far from satisfied is a grotesque understatement. These are the government's promised targets for 2030. That's just 7 years from now. They were also mad at the time, and now the government sees they're hopeless. 82% of our electricity from wind and solar and other renewables. No expert I've heard now believes that's even remotely possible. The rollout is way behind. 43% emissions cuts, also behind. The target for electric cars, 89% of all new car sales by 2030. The government's transport department says they won't even get a third of that. And 10,000 kilometres new transmission wires to hook up all those new wind and solar plants. Again, way behind, often 2 or 3 times over budget, and facing massive community opposition to having these monstrosities over the landscape. So it's chaos. In fact, just it was yesterday, another huge blow to the government's renewable energy scheme. It keeps having these disasters. Chris Bowen has been banking, for instance, on green hydrogen, made from water, very expensive, but a scheme touted by green billionaire Twiggy Forrest to cut our emissions.
That's green hydrogen, the purest source of energy in the world, and one that could replace up to 3/4 of global emissions.
In fact, Andrew Forrest has just canned a promised power plant in Port Kembla that he said would use green hydrogen and gas. One that the federal government actually gave $30 million to 2 years ago. There was a Morrison government then. So I tell you, forget green hydrogen for a long time, if ever. The government's renewable energy plans are a disaster everywhere you look. But the government's response today, use more of your money to underwrite a 5-fold increase in new wind and solar capacity and pumped hydro. All of it backed by the government too. It's your money at risk, subsidising green billionaires like Forrest and other green energy carpetbaggers.
We say to renewable energy developers, the minimum price you need guaranteed, the price over which you'll share your return, make a return to the government, to the taxpayer. And again, they put in their bids and the best bids win. We need to get to 82% renewables.
And all of this to reach Labor's crazy promise to get to 82% renewables by 2030. All that extra money to reach a target that the government's own solicitors have now admitted in court will not change the climate anyway. Not in any ways you'd notice, because we're just too small. But how much money will this take just to do that? Bone today refused to say, out of embarrassment, I reckon.
Can you level with the Australian public and tell us how much it will cost?
Well, it's an auction, PK. Now, when you're putting a house on the market, you don't issue a press release saying this is what we expect to get.
You couldn't even get that right. Someone should tell Bowen that people selling houses do actually announce a set reserve price, and do tell buyers the estimated price range, okay? But Bowen will not tell you how many more billions of dollars of your money this government is now going to waste to reach targets that actually make no difference anyway. Well, no difference to anything but your power bills, which are going up, and your electricity system, which is facing blackouts. This is going to be a disaster, even bigger than The Voice, driven once again by Labor ideologues and dreamers who are totally blind to reality. But to Barnaby Joyce, the Nationals frontbencher and former Deputy Prime Minister. Barnaby, great to see you, as we do on every Thursday. Look, this new push from the government to get lots more renewable energy targets, since its targets are all in trouble, it sounds to me a terrible, terrible mistake.
It's power alchemy, isn't it? I mean, it's just this mythology that somehow we can create in Australia what hasn't been created anywhere else in the world. There's not one country that runs on renewable energy the way where Australia wants to go. And when they try to do it, such as Germany, it falls flat in its face. Now let's look at what Mr. Bowen announced today. He's basically said we're going to go from 6 gigawatts to 32 gigawatts of underwritten by you, the taxpayer, foreign companies basically ripping you off on your power bills. What they will do is they'll say, okay, we can put in a bid, let's put in one. We demand a rate of return of 8%. And then I said, well, we can borrow the money at 4.5%, 8%. This is just money for jam. Well, how do you do that? Well, these fools walk up, and when a fool walks up, you've got to rip them off. And we're ripping off the Australian government, who get their money back from the Australian people, from you. And, if this is so affordable, Mr. Bowen, if it's so logical, why do you need to subsidise it? Shouldn't just the market take care of it, not pop up like mushrooms? But no, it's not working. It's a fiasco, it's a debacle, and it's hurting your listeners. If we don't have cheap energy, and we don't have cheap wages, and resources are at global prices, where's your competitive advantage? How can you grow the economy when it's just structurally deficient in one of its fundamental food stocks, which is energy?
Look, Barnaby, this is a total disaster, and it's just going to get worse. It's a tragedy to see all these extra billions now being promised. I'm going to talk more about this with Terry McCrann after you, but I want to go to a tweet from you that actually surprised me, Barnaby. Yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, shot in the head as he drove in an open car. The man that was blamed, a communist sympathiser, Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself later shot dead by a gangster. And you tweeted that 65% of Americans don't believe the Warren report that this assassination was done only by Oswald with a dodgy ex-military Italian rifle firing from the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository 81 metres away, and at a moving target at that. And you said, nor do I. Why? What is your evidence?
Well, I suppose it's, we don't have the conclusive evidence. The Warren report, 800 pages. Do you know there was 13,000 pages to the report into Dungowan Dam? Now, when you take a person's head, I hate to say it so graphically, a person's head moving in a motor car, 81 metres away is a person with a Carano rifle. But people have disparagingly say the safest place to be in a Carano rifle is in front of the barrel. So he managed to get 3 shots away and tragically a bullseye with a dodgy rifle and a miracle bullet. And the person who led the investigation, Dulles, he was actually sacked by Kennedy. And led the investigation into the assassination of Kennedy. Kennedy had said he'd break up the influence of Cuba within the United States, basically the Cuban cohort, into 1,000 pieces. He had a reason to have a whole range of enemies. And it's just an incredible... I have a rifle, and I have rifles that are much better than a Carano. It probably came out around about 1900, 1910 it was built. And this is just, I believe, it's just beyond belief that this could have happened. And when you look at the ballistics of exactly what happened, it just throws so many questions there, so many questions. And even
I
hearing
suspect
further reports
we will never, ever get to the bottom of it. I tell you, this is a good time to plug someone that I like and whose hospitality I enjoyed when I was the ambassador to The Hague. Brett Mason has written a book that you might be interested in, the former senator, Saving Lieutenant Kennedy, how an Australian soldier in World War II led a group that saved him when he was in the water off the drink off Japanese controlled islands. Brilliant read. Brett Mason can tell a good story. But to a local problem, Barnaby, the good rains of the past couple of years, so much for global warming, has caused a rat plague in central Queensland that has now spread to northern Queensland. It's just so extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. It's so bad, there's actually a carpet of dead rats on the beach at Karumba on the Gulf of Carpentaria. They keep getting drowned by the rising tide. I think they go out to try and get shellfish or something. How serious is this?
Well, I mean, what happens with rats, of course, they get into your motor vehicle, they chew out your wiring, they chew out your air conditioner system, they chew through your gauze. They've obviously had a little bit of a problem with them in the past. They brought about bubonic plague. But putting that aside, they're just filth. And what you'll see is they get into your food, they'll climb into bed with kids. You don't want them. They're nasty bits of work.
Well, I don't know. We've lost sound there. But Barnaby, I don't know about that. But I tell you what, if anyone's got any more gas masks they can send up to the poor people of Karumba, I think they'll be gratefully accepted. Barnaby Joyce, congratulations on your wedding the other week. I'm glad you're back from your honeymoon. Thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. After the break, Terry McCrann and that hostage deal between Hamas and Israel is supposed to start, well, right now, this very hour. But it's hit a hurdle, or maybe there's a trick. And why Anthony Albanese's leadership has failed, a former top Labor official who worked with him, after this break. Now, we're going to come back to this renewable energies plan of the government today, that its targets were going also rubbish. I mean, total disaster, that it's going to actually spend even more of your billions, getting 5 times more than we've got. I mean, seriously. Joining me is Australia's top finance writer, Terry McCrann of the Herald Sun. Terry, the Albanese government sees its renewable energy targets all in trouble, decides to spend even bigger to get a 500% increase at a price it won't even tell us. I mean, I'm just stunned. Your reaction?
Well, exactly, Andrew. That's the starting point of this, that precisely because the whole project, so-called, of replacing all our reliable power stations with ridiculously unreliable wind and solar and batteries, precisely because they can no longer get the investment, and they certainly can't get the investment at the pace they need, quote unquote, to make anything like a contribution to power generation. They are trying to now force feed it. As you say, they've upped by 5 times the amount of money and the objectives in this part of the scheme. They now talk about getting 32 gigawatts of power generation. And it's actually zero real power generation. If you break the 32 gigawatts down, 9 gigawatts only is what they call firming power, which we would regard as a real power station, a coal-fired power station, a coal power station, or perish the thought, a nuclear power station. No, they are batteries that can run for 2 hours. In one case, they claim 4 hours. The other 23 gigawatts is wind and solar and who knows what else in terms of the fantasy power generation. So not only is it going to mean that this doesn't add anything really substantial to our grid, but it's going to accelerate the closure of the real power stations, the coal-fired ones, because obviously when the wind does blow and the sun does shine, the power so-called that is generated is free, and it makes it impossible for, and has to be used, and it makes it impossible for a real power station to continue to operate. So this is a disaster in dollar terms. It's a disaster in terms of actually creating reliable power, and it's going to accelerate the closure of the remaining power stations that we actually have.
It's a shocker. What it also represents is a massive transfer of cash from taxpayers,
absolutely,
including people who can barely afford the power bills now, to rich billionaires like Twiggy Forrest and Mike Cannon-Brookes with their mad green schemes that'll actually leave us without sufficient power for a 21st century economy. Look, I just cannot believe what I just saw today, and I hope the rest of the media wakes up to what's going on, because this is a disaster for the country. But meanwhile, Terry, the Reserve Bank Governor Michelle Bullock now says that our high inflation is not caused, as the government keeps saying, by the way, by what's going on overseas. No, it's domestic. Here she is today.
The remaining inflation challenge we're dealing with is increasingly homegrown and demand-driven.
Terry, inflation now is homegrown. What's the problem? Is it too much government spending? What's going on here?
Well, it's a whole range of things, Andrew. Yes, too much government spending. The whole population explosion caused by migration, which is pouring, demand into the economy, and particularly demand for infrastructure. I mean, you've got this ridiculous situation where we need to bring in migrants to build the infrastructure for those migrants. I mean, it's a round robin which doesn't add anything to the economy in a basic sense, just creates more pressures in the economy. And obviously, too, it's some of the residue from the COVID years where we had supply chain issues and all the rest, which have started to feed into a sustainable, by that I don't mean that positively, a sustainable level of inflation where it becomes self-creating. So I think that I'm very impressed by what Michelle Bullock has been saying in the last month, because she really is laying it out very clearly that she has a job to get inflation down, and she's going to do her job even if it causes pain. And I think that's very important. She's not going to be somebody that kowtows to the government and gives them an easy ride.
I think that's absolutely correct. She's told the government, I'm not your girl. I think she's being quite strong here. Terry McCran, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Now, a week ago, I said that Anthony Albanese's leadership was in crisis. Now, in fact, after another week from hell, I think his authority has been smashed for good. Now, the problem is not just that the leadership he's been delivering is the exact opposite of what he promised.
If I'm Prime Minister, I won't go missing when the going gets tough, or pose for photos and then disappear when there's a job to be done. I'll show up, I'll step up, and I'll work every day to bring our country together.
Now, what a joke that was. In fact, since then, the Prime Minister has gone missing very often, thanks to all that travel. He's posed for pictures an awful lot. And then, yes, he has disappeared when there is a job to be done, like the other day, keeping murderers off our street or keeping the cost of living down. And instead of working to bring us together, he's, of course, campaigned to divide us by race with his disastrous voice to Parliament. Now, the thing is, when that voice was defeated, I think something broke. Now, Albanese already seemed distracted by the voice, is still distracted by all the travel, hasn't been able to focus on the basics like cost of living. He has seemed too wowed by the luxuries and the pampering that comes with being Prime Minister. You know those tennis stickers, Australian Open, the Gwen Stefani concert he went to last week with world leaders, the flattery from China.
People were saying that we have a handsome boy coming from Australia.
And now our Prime Minister commands so little respect that he's even asked today, or yesterday, whether he had sex in the White House. And really, he loved it.
When you're staying at the White House with your other half, you've got to,
Chris in the room.
You've got to,
what goes on tour stays on tour.
Now, with this leadership vacuum, it seems to me the government is falling to bits. These past 2 weeks, what a disaster. More than 60 criminals and undesirables released from immigration detention with almost no security. 860 Palestinians given temporary visas with minimal checks. China's leader not confronted about an attack on our Navy divers. Now this panic spending on Labor's climate targets. I could go on. Joining me is Cameron Milner. He was Chief of Staff to Bill Shorten when he was the Labor leader before Albanese replaced him, and wrote a devastating column about him in The Australian this week, which I think is a must-read. Thank you for your time. You worked with Anthony Albanese. You know him. Why has his leadership suddenly hit the wall, as it were?
Well, I think this has been coming. I think this is an erosion from the start. There was such promise and such under-delivery. The Prime Minister's been distracted on his Albanese voice, and he's simply been absent from the country. He's not been a Prime Minister dealing with the cost of living, which is the #1 issue for Australians.
But is it, I don't quite get it, is it that he sort of got into the Prime Ministership by default and, suddenly we now see him for what he is, that he was given a lot of leeway, people expected much, and now the reality's there. Is it that he's lazy, maybe, not on top of detail, or maybe he's just unlucky? I don't know.
Well, detail's never been an Albanese thing, so put that to one side. He's not a details man, but he's not lazy. He's not lazy. He has been travelling the world, doing a diplomatic Kentucky tour. As someone said, he's flown to the moon and beyond. So he's been working hard at 40,000 feet. What people want to see, though, is him working hard as the Prime Minister of Australia, dealing with cost of living, which is a crippling pressure on families and businesses alike.
But Cameron, obviously international travel is part of a Prime Minister's job. The public may not like it. Good for Australia. I mean, I would question how much travel has been doing, what results has been getting, and sometimes the focus of it. But I also wonder, is it just, well, look, it's been caught out by having to do what's necessary, or is there also an element of, by golly, I'm enjoying this a lot. I'm really famous now, and look at these selfies and all that kind of stuff. What is it?
Well, certainly, travelling the world and being feted at state dinners and summits, having the President of China call you a handsome boy. I'm sure they're all great compliments, and I'm sure he feels very good about himself. But the job of the Prime Minister isn't to be the Minister for Foreign Affairs. It's to be the Prime Minister of Australia and spend more time in our country dealing with the #1 issue, which is cost of living.
But I'm trying to work out what's driving him, right? He's made a big pitch about being the boy from Housing Commission flat, single mother, and I thought it was a great... In fact, I recommended when he was running for the leadership that he stick that in his speeches. I said, you've got to make more of it. I didn't realise he'd make this much of it, but anyway, put that to one side. Look, I don't come from a rich family myself, but I do wonder sometimes whether, coming from that background, Albanese is giving the vibe of a boy that's made good to even his own surprise, and that it's gone to his head, he's giddy with it, and that's why, for instance, the Chinese think that they can flatter him by calling him a handsome boy and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, look, the silver service on Toto 1 at 40,000 feet is probably pretty good from a boy from Housing Commission. But that said, he's had 27 years in Parliament and he's now a rich person. He has multi-million-dollar rental portfolio. He is a long way distant from his time as being a kid in the Housing Commission, and that trapping of office and trapping of wealth is reflecting on his out-of-touchness in terms of what he's trying to deal with in terms of cost of living for everyday Australians.
But is that what's driving this? I'm still not 100% sure I get what's driving it, because he said he wanted to do cost of living. He said as a boy from the Housing Commission, his heart's with the working class, but it's not translating.
Because cost of living is a hard job. The person who's doing the job for Albanese is Jim Chalmers. Jim Chalmers is actually every single day doing what he can as Treasurer of Australia, but he's got one hand tied behind his back because the Prime Minister's not at the Prime Ministerial desk. He's at someone else's desk having a state reception or being feted. We need a Prime Minister back in Australia dealing with the #1 Australian issue, which is cost of living.
Well, I think he'll be back in Australia a lot more now. I think he's been burnt on the travel. You mentioned Jim Chalmers. What do you think some of his colleagues will be thinking, particularly people with an eye to the leadership themselves? Jim Chalmers, Tony Burke, Tanya Plibersek.
Jim Chalmers, without doubt, has put his name forward for a future Labor leadership. If you're a betting person, he's short-priced favourite to be the next Labor leader because he's doing the work that matters. He's there on the ground dealing with cost of living. And last weekend's Glossy magazine piece was simply the start of that campaign for leadership.
Are you saying, therefore, that the leadership is becoming in play now?
Look, I think there's been enough backroom chats between backbenchers and frontbenchers that I hear around Canberra that people are worried about where the Prime Minister's taking the Labor Party. They're worried about his plummeting numbers, and they're worried that Peter Dutton, who is, according to the Albanistas, unelectable, now looks like he's competitive.
But how serious do you think that is? I mean, there's always going to be leadership chatter. Every Prime Minister has to deal with that. Do you think it's going to lead to something? Because I just wonder, I just think, Cameron, for Albanese, it's almost all downhill from here. You've got inflation not coming down as it should. You've got cost of living being a real problem. You've got electricity prices. That promise is not going to be met. I'm just trying to think where the easy wins are for him to actually get himself back in the game. So I just wonder whether this could prove a long slide downhill for him, and maybe even, I don't know, like I say, leadership trouble.
Well, his numbers are falling faster than a downhill skier at the moment in terms of rate of descent. What he needs to do is clear the diary. He should come up to Queensland and walk a shopping centre with Jim Chalmers. Jim Chalmers talks to people. Chalmers talks to people in his electorate. Albo should go along with Jim Chalmers this weekend at Logan Central and meet people doing it tough and actually hear their pain of the cost of living. 12 interest rate rises from this government already. He should be out there listening to people and hearing their pain in a shopping centre this weekend.
Cameron Milner, hasn't escaped me that you've mentioned Jim Chalmers' name quite often here. So we shall see. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you for your time too, Andrew.
Now, that hostage deal between Israel and the Hamas terrorists who run Gaza has been delayed. There's going to be a 4-day truce starting right now, this hour, with Hamas releasing 50 of the Israeli hostages it took on October 7, children and women, in exchange for 150 Palestinian prisoners in Israel, criminals. Now, that's been delayed now for at least a day. Joining me again is Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner of the Israel Defence Forces. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you for your time. Why this delay?
Good question. I can't confirm we didn't announce the expected time that it would begin, and therefore we have not received the instructions when it will begin. This is the nature of, I would say, the suspicion between Israel and Hamas. And so there could be hiccups along the way. From our perspective, we are waiting for the instruction from the government to decide when exactly we should hold our fire from and take the necessary steps in order to be ready for both holding our fire on one hand and also bringing back the hostages on the other.
Yeah, there were reports that Hamas is not saying exactly who it's releasing. I mean, are they going to be live people? Who knows what the heck? Well, given that, I'm just wondering whether Hamas has effectively won itself another day of truce, which is today, an extra day, without releasing any hostages. Because I wonder how much you can do, given that you were expecting not to be shooting today. Have you actually downed weapons for the day?
Absolutely not. We are operating throughout northern Gaza Strip, expanding our operations, continuing to pursue Hamas, engaging the enemy wherever they are. We have a very clear message that we are continuing our war efforts, and if there is an operational pause, as instructed by the government, then it'll be an operational pause, nothing more than that. We will plan on continuing and advancing the stages after the operational pause, as instructed by the government and the Chief of Staff, the IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, yesterday initiated and approved the operational plans for after the operational pause. So I would say, we are moving forward. We're continuing to engage. We're revealing hundreds of tunnels, and indeed, yesterday we announced that since the beginning of the war, almost 7 weeks ago, we have destroyed some 400 tunnels and tunnel access points. We're continuing to reveal to the world the extent of the tunnel system that Hamas have built and used beneath the Shifa hospital. Unfortunately, we're watching as in awe, I think, with what's happening in Shifa hospital, and it appears that the international community, specifically the WHO, have nothing to say about it. They're not condemning Hamas, not even concerned about it. They're only concerned about how the IDF are operating in and around hospitals. But when we have proven that the concept of operations of Hamas is to use hospitals as protective, I would say, Iron Dome system to protect themselves from IDF operations, the international community seemed to be very confused about what's right and what's wrong.
Well, I noticed the World Health Organization was saying, oh, how shocking that you have military operations near a hospital. This is terrible. But as you say, hasn't said anything about the weapons you've found, even behind MRI machines. But that said, I wonder whether you're disappointed that when you got down in that maze of tunnels and you showed the rooms and all that kind of stuff right under the hospital, that there was actually little equipment, little to show that this was a Hamas headquarters. It was cleaned out. Was that a disappointment to you?
I think anybody with a reasonable mind in an understanding of the situation, for us, saying for weeks that we intend on going to the Al-Shifa hospital, telling the people to evacuate the hospital, basically announcing everything except the specific time and date when we were coming. I think they would be very, very. It would be very, very strange if we would have found everything in an operational situation. But yes, we know that they are operating there. We revealed how they tried to conceal it. They actually cemented the entrance points in order to try and prevent us from finding the access points to the tunnel system. So of course, when they understood that we're coming, they did everything in order to try and mitigate that. But even in all those efforts, over almost a month, throughout the month, they still left stuff behind that was incriminating and very decisive, the fact that they had been using. And that's even without the videos that we released.
Yes,
showing
I've shown
them
some of that.
Taking in hostages into the hospital.
Yes, before I go, I saw a picture, Lieutenant Colonel Lerner, of the Hamas leadership in Gaza with crosses over the ones that you've managed to kill. It's just over a third, doesn't include the very top leaders, but a third are gone. The ultimate bosses over in Qatar, they're still living their life of Riley over there. How much damage do you think you've done to Hamas's fighting ability?
We're engaging them daily. We are killing them in their operational positions, in their command posts, in their observation positions, in their tunnels. The tunnels perhaps can be an advantage, but they can also be death traps. So I would say we're advancing. They wouldn't have wanted the operational pause if it wasn't for the IDF's pressure on them. So they feel pursued. They are concerned for their lives, and clearly it's having an effect. I wouldn't want to put numbers on it, but we have several thousands of terrorists that have been killed in the engagements with the IDF, and we intend and continuing to dismantle and destroy them and their capabilities.
Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. After the break, today's school strike for Palestine. Turns out it actually started a lot of older people, leftists, with a message of hate. Plus the stunning win in the Dutch election of a party that says no to Muslim immigration. Tell you about that after this. Now, before I get to the Stunning news from Holland, the election victory of Geert Wilders, leader of a party that's actually promised to stop Muslim immigration. A contrast back here. Now, as I said last night, the Albanese government has quietly issued temporary visas to 860 Palestinians over the past 6 weeks. And the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister today offered these excuses, both deceitful.
These are not permanent visas. These are temporary visas. There are the same security checks that are in place for people, for Australians, that have been in place, this regime, for a long period of time.
Just as not everybody from Afghanistan is linked with the Taliban, not everybody who is Palestinian is a member of a terrorist organisation.
Let's fact check. First, Albanese's claim. In fact, 860 visas in 6 weeks are far too many, too quickly for any real security checks, particularly when many of these Palestinians will come from Gaza, which is led by an Islamist terrorist group that's now at war and with no Australian officials around to do any checks there. As for Penny Wong's claim, oh, well, not everyone is a member of a terrorist organisation like Hamas. Well, maybe Penny Wong, some members of them. And how many actually would be Hamas supporters? Because that's also important, given that a new poll shows that 75% of Palestinians actually do back Hamas and do back its shocking slaughter of 1,200 Israelis on October 7. I would have thought that's rather relevant, Foreign Minister. So I'm not surprised that one leading Jewish group is now leaning to a more discriminatory immigration policy here for its safety, starting with these Palestinians.
The whole worldview that young people growing up in Gaza and older people as well have developed has been that has been fed to them by Hamas. Are they compatible with Australian values and living alongside a Jewish community that they've been raised to hate?
And now to that contrast with the Netherlands. Now, I think the aggressive protests we have seen by pro-Palestinians, particularly in Europe, have caused a huge reaction in yesterday's Dutch election. Shock result that's going to rock Europe, because the winner in this historically tolerant country is Geert Wilders, the right-wing anti-immigration politician who wants Muslim immigration banned, as he did say on his visit to Australia.
People are saying enough is enough. Let us reclaim our country. Stop the mass immigration from Islamic countries.
Now, Geert Wilders' party won 35 seats. Everyone's saying victory. That is at least 10 more than the Labour Greens coalition that came second. So that's great. But it doesn't actually guarantee he'll become Prime Minister, because there are actually 150 seats in the Parliament. He'll need to cobble together a coalition, and the main parties all say they'll refuse to work with him, right? It's on the nose. But he might become Prime Minister, and the signal has been sent to all Europe, because even the Dutch now, the tolerant Dutch, have had enough of mass immigration, often from people who won't share their local culture. Joining me is Sky News presenter James McPherson of The Late Debate here on Sky at 10 p.m, and Evelyn Ray, writer and podcast host and on Sky and everything. James McPherson, the Dutch election result, how do you read it?
Well, there's two really interesting things that have happened here, Andrew. The first is that the popularity of Geert Wilders' party rose sharply after the October 7 attacks on Israel. Between October 7 and November 22, the polls had him go from 12% to 23% in popularity. And what happened during that period was mass pro-Palestinian rallies on the streets of Holland and indeed in cities around Europe. And I think Dutch people saw this and have reacted to it and said, we need to address this quickly, and so they've voted for Geert Wilders. The other thing that's interesting is CBS television published crime statistics in Holland from 2022, and they looked at the perpetrators by country of origin, and they found that Dutch people did not feature in the top 20 nations of origin when it came to perpetrators of crime in their own country. You remember in 2015 there was a massive influx of migrants into Europe, and I think Dutch people 8 years later, seeing the consequences of that, have said we need to take our nation back, and hence the election result.
Yes, I've been surprised by how my own very left-wing relatives there, who I love dearly, have changed some of their views over time as well as a result of all this. But Evelyn, meanwhile here, we're letting in 860 Palestinians when there's clearly been little time for security checks, when clearly Jewish community leaders are worried, you know, given all the hate they're already facing here. Seems to be a little bit of a contrast.
I'd like to ask the question, Andrew, why doesn't a country near them take them in? Why doesn't Israel take them in? If they aren't terrorists and they aren't allegedly a security threat, why wouldn't Israel or any other surrounding Arab nation take them in? Is it perhaps that they fear something that our own government is too politically correct to consider? I mean, let's face the reality here. Israel does not know who every member of Hamas is or who its supporters are. How much less would we know over here in Australia? And second to that, we need to remember when you import a person, you don't just import their physical self, you import their ideas, you import their ideologies. And I don't think 6 weeks is enough time to figure out all of that to any proper degree, any degree that would make Australians at least feel safe. And every second day, we're being told that there's a housing crisis here in Australia. So I'd like all the politicians who are pushing for this, Albanese, Penny Wong, I'd like them to offer up their Marrickville homes, their Canberra apartments, and all of that for all of the housing crisis that's happening. Meanwhile, we're importing 860 people in 6 weeks. It's absolutely absurd. It's crazy. And I think we're yet to see the consequences of it, unfortunately.
And of course, Egypt, right next to a bordering Gaza, it says no to immigrants, Palestinian immigrants. Jordan, next to the sharing a border with the West Bank, says also no. Our government seems to have a different idea. And James, this will not be a lot of these people will not be temporary immigrants. So let's put that to one side. The government says, it's just temporary visas. What, they're going to be sending them back if the war's still on? I'm not so sure about that.
And it's funny, when Anthony Albanese said that they're on temporary visas, the question he was asked is how can the Australian government be sure that these people are okay to come into our country? They're not a security threat. And his answer was, don't worry, they're on temporary visas, which is hardly very reassuring. The other weird answer from the government here was from Penny Wong. When she was criticised for bringing in 860 Palestinian refugees, she responded by saying, well, we've brought in 1,700 Israeli refugees, as if you're comparing apples with apples. And this is the problem with cultural relativism, where we assume that all cultures are alike and all are equally able to integrate into Australian society. We know that's not correct. We're seeing it every weekend on the streets of our cities around this country. And for the government to practice this cultural relativism as their guiding principle for our immigration program is not only insane, it's dangerous.
Now, Evelyn, before I get to you, I just first want to show viewers scenes from the school strike for Palestine today, as James mentions, protests on the street, because this was different to what we were told to expect, you know, just students, a student strike, just wanting an end to people dying in this war. First, well, yes, there were students there. There were a few hundred, including a fair few in Islamic clothing and African students as well, which I rather think is a bit sad and ominous, but anyway. The crowd, though, was also padded out by a lot of adults, as some pushing other leftist causes, you know, buy one, get one free. Quite a few, in fact, as well as university students from the Marxist Socialist Alliance and the equally Marxist Socialist Alternative, plus a mother who decided that she should share the mic with the kids. And the second point, Evelyn, is that this was really a hate protest against Israel, a protest that called for its destruction from the river to the sea.
The Australian state genocided Indigenous communities. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free!
Israel is on stolen land, and that's Palestine, not Israel.
They should give back the stolen land, it's not theirs. Genocided Indigenous communities. The Indigenous and Palestinian struggle goes hand in hand.
Evelyn, your reaction to all that?
I think it's nothing new seeing infiltrators taking over rallies. I mean, we've seen it from, time and time again. But when you hold a public protest, it's inevitably going to attract people who want to advance their own agenda. But it's also no surprise that children in particular jump on this because they're starved of purpose and meaning in life. Kids don't know why they exist. It's how it's designed. It's how they've been indoctrinated. And so when you feed them a steady diet of Marxism, they can't help but view every conflict as a struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors. Kids are ripe for exploitation. Lefties love jumping on these things. This is the fruit of Marxism. Marxists can't see the world any other way. They instantly side with whoever they are told is oppressed. And in this case, it's Palestine. Doesn't matter how evil the oppressed class is, by virtue of them being labelled oppressed, they are seen as the good guys and the oppressors as evil. And it unfortunately is whoever has the power.
And of course, Israel is capitalist, so that makes it even more an enemy of these two Marxist groups that were there recruiting, seeding hate and trying to profit off it. But what did you make of it, James, particularly that appeal at the end? And we see it quite often now. Well, this is the cause here of Aborigines is linked to that of the Palestinians. They're both Indigenous, therefore we support them both.
Yeah, well, key Aboriginal activist Marsha Langton came out a week or so ago and said there is no similarity between the case of the Palestinians and any grievances that Australian Indigenous people have. But I'd have a couple of questions about this protest, Andrew. Number one, if it were held on Saturday rather than Thursday, how many of those young people would have been there? Number two, why are so many adults at a kids' protest unless they are simply manipulating these young children? Number three, where are the parents of these kids? How are these kids not in school and why are their parents not enforcing that? And number four, how can this generation be so ignorant? They're calling for a ceasefire. Well, there's a ceasefire on the table. It's Hamas that haven't yet signed it and come to the party. They're yelling out Allah Akbar. This is an expression used by terrorists as they raped, murdered and kidnapped Jewish civilians. And on top of all of that, they're protesting as kids. Well, shouldn't they be protesting for the 30 children and babies who are now being held hostage in Gaza? I am so depressed watching these protests happen. If this is the state of our country, we are in big, big trouble, Andrew.
And Evelyn and James, as you would both know, if you want to make an analogy with Indigenous people over in that conflict, the Jews were in around the area of Jerusalem a lot longer than the Palestinians. So maybe they're the Indigenous people the left should be reaching out to. Evelyn Ray, James McPherson, thank you both so much for your time. After the break, here we go again. Is the government's border policy falling apart because another boat lands on our coast? It was always going to happen, wasn't it? A boat from Indonesia has landed about 12 people on the coast of the Kimberley, Western Australia. Now, they could actually be illegal fishermen, but they could also be asylum seekers. And with a boat from Indonesia, what are the odds there'll be genuine asylum seekers fleeing imminent danger? So I'd probably put my money on fake refugees. The Australian Border Force isn't commenting, that's a sign, but has whisked them off to immigration detention in Nauru. And who would be surprised that boat people do think Australia once more has a Labor government that's weak on borders? I mean, just last week, more than 80 foreigners, including even killers and rapists, released onto the streets, yes, by the High Court, but with no controls. That's on the Albanese government. Nothing to make sure they are where they're supposed to be. This week, 860 Palestinians were given temporary visas with minimal background checks. For all we know, Hamas could use this opportunity to get a few of its friends over here. Earlier this year, 19,000 illegal boat people were allowed to stay on permanent visas. So really, hello, you may as well stand on the shores and say, Labor government in power, come on over. And one boat might have done just that. Also, just one little item. You know how I keep saying the ABC doesn't have a single conservative host of a mainstream program anywhere. Not one. Now it has lost one of its two, probably its only, Conservative on a non-mainstream program. Tom Switzer has quit from Radio National, a little weekend show. They tucked him away to say, oh, got one. He's not commenting, but a source in The Australian says, well, he used to pick, it wasn't what he said, but he sometimes talked to guests that didn't toe the ABC line. And even that, even when he challenged them and had to balance them with another guest, was too much. Debate on the ABC is dead. Goodbye, Tom Switzer. That's it from me. Chris Kenny next. Good night.